Explaining the Cold War. Immediately after World War II, many things would happen all across the world, especially Europe. The Soviet Union would be given control of the former German territory of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the United States had a large influence over Western Europe. Germany had also been divided between France, the UK, the United States, and, obviously, the USSR. The capital of Germany, Berlin, would also be divided among these countries, despite the fact that it was deep within Soviet territory. With the Soviet Union controlling all of Eastern Europe, they would set up communist regimes across these countries. This would cause the already miserable lives of the people in these countries to become even worse due to communism. The United States would not like this. The United States would support democratic uprisings against communism across the world, while the Soviet Union would support communist revolutions across the world. On March 12, 1947, the United States would announce the Truman Doctrine, meant to stop the spread of communism around the world. In 1948, the Soviets would launch the Berlin blockade to stop connection between West and East Berlin. However, this would be stopped by the U.S., who would use airlifts to bring food and other supplies to East Berlin. On April 4, 1949, NATO would be formed to stop Soviet expansion. However, the world would become shocked when on August 29, 1949, the Soviets would test their first nuclear bomb. The United States was no longer the only country with nuclear bombs. And to make things even worse, on December 7, 1949, the Chinese Civil War would come to an end, and sadly for the U.S., the Communists would come out on top. Then, not long after, in 1950, the Korean War would break out between Communist North Korea and anti-Communist South Korea. Throughout this, the U.S. and the USSR would compete to gain the support of Latin American countries and the newly decolonizing Africa and Asia. In 1955, the Soviet Union would form their own NATO, being the Warsaw Pact. In that same year, the Vietnam War would break out between Communist North Vietnam and anti-Communist South Vietnam. The U.S. would obviously join the war on the side of the anti-Communist Southern Vietnamese, especially after one of their ships was bombed by the North Vietnamese. During the Hungarian Revolution in 1965, they would crush it, and during the Suez Crisis, they would exploit Arab nationalism by selling supplies to Egypt. Then, in June of 1961, the Soviets would send an ultimatum to the West, telling them to remove their troops from West Berlin. They would refuse, and because of this, on August 13, 1961, the Soviets would begin to construct the Berlin Wall, attempting to keep the East Berliners from leaving to West Berlin. This would come to its conclusion when the U.S. Chief of Mission would be stopped in his car when trying to enter East Berlin. Because of this, U.S. tanks would roll up to the Berlin Wall, and Soviet tanks would do the same. For the next 16 hours, they would be in a standoff, and if any of them had fired at the other, a war would have most certainly started. This would not happen, however, and instead the tanks would slowly back away. However, only a year after this crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis would begin when Soviet missiles were found inside of the newly communist Cuba. However, this too would be resolved. Meanwhile, protests against nuclear weapons and war became increasingly popular during the 1960s, and this would continue throughout the 1970s and 80s. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Sino-Soviet split would occur, complicating relations within the communist sphere. The Soviet Union would crush an uprising inside of Prague in 1968, and the U.S. would experience internal turmoil because of civil rights movements and opposition to the Vietnam War. During the 1970s, a period of détente would begin, at which point the U.S. would open relations with China to act as a counterweight with the USSR. On March 29, 1973, the U.S. would withdraw their involvement from Vietnam. Because of this, South Vietnam would collapse and would come under the control of Communist North Vietnam, now united into just Vietnam. The period of peace would come to an end in 1979 when the Soviets began to expand their influence into Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War. The 1980s would become another time of tension for the world. The US would increase its economic pressures on the Soviet Union at a time where its economy was already stagnant. In the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev would come into power within the Soviet Union, and he would introduce reforms, being Glasnost and Perestroika. Even though Gorbachev's actions were meant to do good, his actions would lead to political instability within the Soviet Union. Gorbachev would then end the Soviets' involvement in the Soviet-Afghan War. Then, around that same time, people within the Eastern European nations wanted more national sovereignty, and when asked, Gorbachev would say that although he did not agree with the reforms, he would not stop them like previous Soviet leaders had. Because of his response, revolutions would break out all over Eastern Europe and would peacefully, minus Romania, overthrow their communist governments. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall would be torn down, finally reuniting East and West Germany. Then, after the failed August coup, on December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union would be dissolved. This would bring the Cold War to an end. In conclusion, the Cold War was an ideological war between communism and capitalism, mainly between the United States and the Soviet Union, in which they fought multiple proxy wars to see whether or not capitalism or communism came out on top. Thank you for watching this video on the Cold War.